In 1972, an American town paid a man $2,400 to spray its streets. By 1985, the entire town had been erased from the map. The U.S. government bought it, burned it, and buried it, and nobody went to prison. Times Beach, Missouri. Population 2,240. Located 17 miles southwest of St. Louis, sitting on a floodplain beside the Meramec River. It looked like any other working-class American town. It wasn't. The chemical quietly soaking into their soil was 2,000 times more toxic than Agent Orange. And the children of Times Beach, they played in it. They slid through it. They called it the purple goo. Times Beach was born in 1925 as a promotional gimmick. Buy a 20 by 100 foot lot for $67.50 and get a 6-month newspaper subscription thrown in. The street, Louis Star Times needed readers. They built a town to get them. In the early years, it was a summer resort families escaping the city heat along the river. Modest, peaceful, exactly the kind of place nobody in power would ever think twice about. The Great Depression changed everything. The summer crowd never came back. What was once a getaway became a permanent settlement for low-income families with nowhere else to go. By the 1960s, Times Beach had 23 miles of unpaved dirt roads cutting through its neighborhoods. No tax base to pave them, no federal money coming in, just dust thick, choking Missouri dust. Summer after summer, the town needed a cheap fix, and in 1972, they found one. What they didn't know was that the fix would cost them everything. 300 miles away in Verona, Missouri, a chemical plant was quietly producing something the U.S. Army needed desperately, a herbicide designed to strip entire jungles bare. The world knew it as Agent Orange. The plant was run by Hoffman Taff. In 1969, they leased part of the facility to a company called Nepaco, Northeastern Pharmaceutical and Chemical Company. Nepaco wasn't making Agent Orange. They were making hexachlorophene, an antibacterial found in soap, toothpaste, household disinfectants. But both processes, Agent Orange and hexachlorophene, produced the same deadly byproduct, a chemical so stable, so persistent, so ruthlessly toxic that scientists struggled to find words strong enough to describe it. 2,3,7,8 tetrachlorodibenzo, P, dioxin, TCDD, dioxin. Once it enters the human body, it doesn't leave. It locks into fat cells and stays for over 10 years. By 1972, Nepaco had accumulated massive quantities of dioxin-laced waste sitting in storage tanks at the Verona facility. It was a liability. It was expensive to dispose of legally, so they found a cheaper way. Nepaco hired a middleman, a company called IPC, Independent Petrochemical Corporation. IPC's job was simple: make the problem disappear. IPC, in turn, hired a man named Russell Bliss. Russell Martin Bliss was a waste oil hauler. He drove across Missouri collecting used motor oil from service stations and sold it back as road spray. Cheap, legal, practical. Nobody looked too closely at what was in his tanks. Bliss collected up to 6 truckloads of industrial waste from the Nepaco facility in Verona. He hauled it back to his tank farm in Frontenac, Missouri, and mixed it directly with the used motor oil he was already spraying on roads. He charged 6 cents per gallon. He got the toxic waste for free. Nepaco paid him to take it. Russell Bliss was being paid on both ends to spread one of the most dangerous chemicals on Earth across American streets. In 1972, Times Beach hired Bliss to spray its 23 miles of unpaved roads. The contract total, $2,400. In today's money, roughly $17,000. That's what it cost to condemn an entire American town. Bliss's truck rolled through Times Beach neighborhoods in the golden Missouri afternoons. A faint purple tint shimmered in the mist. The dust settled. Residents smiled. The roads were finally manageable. Children chased the spray truck down the street. They slid through the purple-tinted puddles. Parents watched from porches and felt, for the first time in years, like their town was finally getting something right. They had no idea. Times Beach wasn't Bliss's only client. Across Missouri, he was spraying over 30 different locations, and at each one, the same pattern began to emerge. First, the animals. The 25th of May 1971, the owners of Shenandoah Stables near Moscow Mills paid Bliss $150 to spray their arena. Within days, birds fell motionless from fence posts. Cats stopped moving. Dogs disappeared. Then the horses. Over 40 registered quarter horses died at Shenandoah Stables alone. At Bubbling Springs, 6 more. At Timberline, 12 more. In total, at least 62 horses died or had to be destroyed. The stable owners were watching their livelihoods collapse one body at a time. Then the children started getting sick. The 6-year-old daughter of the Shenandoah stable owner developed severe symptoms within days of playing in the arena. She was rushed to the hospital. Inflamed bladder, severe internal bleeding. Doctors had no explanation. The Missouri Department of Health called the CDC. Investigators arrived in hazmat protocols to a place that looked like an ordinary horse stable. Soil samples were taken. Everyone was told to wait. The Shenandoah family would eventually settle their lawsuit against Bliss for $10,000 and against IPC for $100,000. In 1983, IPC paid $1 million to each of the daughters. But by then, a much larger catastrophe was already years in motion. The 30th of July 1974, CDC lab results confirmed dioxin in Shenandoah stable soil at over 30 parts per million. The safe threshold is 1 part per billion. They were looking at contamination levels that had no precedent in American civilian history. Investigators confronted Russell Bliss directly. He claimed complete ignorance. He said he had no idea what was in the waste he'd collected from Nepico, his trucks, his tanks, his roads, but he said he never knew. The CDC narrowed their search to Missouri chemical companies using trichlorophenol, a precursor in dioxin production. Of every company on the list, only one had any documented connection to Russell Bliss, NE-PACO. The investigation moved slowly, bureaucratically. For years, residents of Times Beach went about their lives completely unaware that investigators were quietly drawing a line from a chemical plant to their doorsteps. In late 1979, a Nepico employee broke. He confessed the company's entire practice of dioxin waste handling to federal investigators. The government filed suit against Nepico the following year, but Times Beach still didn't know its name was on the list. November 1982. Times Beach City Clerk Judy Leisner received a phone call from a journalist. A reporter had obtained an internal government document, a list of suspected dioxin contamination sites across Missouri. Times Beach was near the top. The EPA arrived in Times Beach with sampling equipment in late November 1982. They drilled into roads. They scraped soil from front yards. They tested right-of-ways where children played every afternoon, and then they waited for results. The 3rd of December 1982, the EPA took its final soil sample from Times Beach. The lab result came back days later. Dioxin levels 300 times higher than the amount considered safe. The town was already toxic. Then the river came. The Meramec River had always been a risk. Times Beach sat on a floodplain. Everyone knew it. But the December 1982 flood was historic. The river overflowed its banks and swallowed the town whole. 10 feet of black water rose through the streets. Furniture floated out of windows. Cars vanished beneath the surface. And beneath every wave, the dioxin-saturated soil was being stirred, dissolved, and spread into every corner of every property in Times Beach. The flood didn't just destroy homes. It turned Times Beach into an invisible contamination event. Invisible, uncontainable, and now irreversible. The poison that had been sitting quietly in the roads for a decade had just been set free. Residents who had evacuated ahead of the flood were already calling about when they could come back. They were rebuilding in their minds, measuring damage, planning repairs. They didn't know yet that they would never be allowed to return. The 23rd of December 1982, 2 days before Christmas, EPA Administrator Ann Burford stepped in front of cameras and made an announcement that shattered 2,000 lives in under 3 minutes. Dangerous levels of dioxin had been confirmed in Times Beach soil. Residents who had fled the flood were advised not to return. Those who had stayed were told to leave immediately and to take nothing with them. Families who had owned their homes for decades stood in winter cold, staring at a town they would never enter again. Christmas decorations still hung in windows behind police barriers. Presents sat under trees inside locked doors. On the 7th of January 1983, President Ronald Reagan created the Times Beach Dioxin Task Force, pulling in the EPA, CDC, FEMA, and the Army Corps of Engineers. When the Army Corps gets involved in your town, it means your town is already gone. The displaced families began looking for housing in neighboring Missouri communities. What they found was something they hadn't expected. Doors closed in their faces. Neighbors refused to rent to them. Entire communities feared that the Times Beach residents themselves were contagious. The 22nd of February 1983, EPA Administrator Ann Burford stood in a locked hotel conference room near Times Beach and made a second announcement. The federal government would purchase purchased the entire town using Superfund dollars. 800 residential properties, 30 businesses. Total buyout, $33 million of the estimated $36.7 million cost the largest federal buyout of a private community in American history. The first of its kind, a nation purchasing its own mistake. Over 14,000 individual lawsuits had been filed against NAPACO, IPC, Syntex Agribusiness, and Russell Bliss. Courts wrestled with the cases for years. In 1990, Syntex was ordered to incinerate contaminated soils from all Missouri dioxin sites and reimburse $10 million to the Superfund. Russell Bliss maintained his innocence. He said he never knew. The courts remarkably believed him. Because the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act wasn't law until 1976, Bliss had no legal obligation to track what was in his tanks. He was never convicted of a single crime. By 1985, Times Beach was empty. Every resident gone except one elderly couple who refused to leave, quietly defying the government from inside the contamination zone until arrangements were made for them.